Hello, my name is Anna Lehn. Welcome to this Asynchronous PD. I have titled it Bite-Size Bilingual, and the big picture is that we are going to talk about this idea called translanguaging. So thank you for joining me. First off, I want to let you know that I will be doing a fair amount of talking for the next bit. If you want to get on the move, if you want to go for a walk, if you need to doodle, if you would prefer to be in your garden or by a sunny window, do what helps you listen best. You sure can pull out your phone or computer and look at the slides that I'll be showing, but most of this will also be audio. So if you need to move and just occasionally look at the screen, I support you. Before we begin, I know this isn't technically two-way, but how are you? Check in with yourself. Is there a word, a color, or a movement that describes how you feel? All right, here is who I am. My name's Anna Lehn. I teach 8th grade ELA at Jefferson Global Studies and Humanities Magnet. Fifth-year teacher at MPS and a high school charter. I've added my ESL license, and I am multilingual. I speak English, French, and Spanish. The image credit here is to my student Yasmin from last year, and I, again, support you like Yasmin, perhaps doodling or doing whatever it takes for you to listen and learn well. Another quick check-in opportunity for you with yourself or with students is to write in your head or on paper a 6-word memoir right now. This is a great way to very briefly, using any and all language resources you have, including emojis, check in with where you're at. A 6-word memoir for me this week could be that I have been flocking to zinnias like a butterfly. Here is the plan today. I'll talk about why I got interested in translanguaging. Some of these moments in my life might resonate with you. We'll talk about a big idea called liberatory ratiolinguistic classrooms, which is the big goal. If translanguaging is a tool, what are we aiming at? We'll talk about that. We'll get into translanguaging, and then I will share some kind of high-level things from my research that I found in terms of what translanguaging can look like the nuts and bolts in our classrooms. I like food, so I'll use some food metaphors to talk about flexible methods and responsive methods, bite-sized practices, and larger projects. Here is a little bit about why I got interested in translanguaging. I used to teach at a school outside of the district where we had to call our key fobs electronic access keys, or EAKs. And this was because fob was a slur that was thrown around between students that meant fresh off the boat. It was a way of implying that linguistically, some students were less, that they were non-native, that they didn't belong, that their English was not up to par. It was a tool of oppression. I would describe this setting as a white supremacist ratiolinguistic climate. It's a mouthful, but think about how in this example, and examples perhaps that you have seen, how race and language are intersecting to lower some and lift up others. With this climate in mind, I, in my training as an ESL teacher on top of ELA, encountered the Thomas and Collier graph. You may have seen this before. Sometimes it's just called the graph. And it shows the differences in outcomes on English standardized reading tests for multilingual students in different ESL programs over a long term, over their whole course of study in public schools. And the findings are repeated and startling. Only long-term bilingual programs close the gap between multilingual students and their native English counterparts on these English reading tests. And long-term bilingual programs actually push the multilingual students past their native English counterparts on English reading standardized tests. So looking at this data, it's really clear to me. It felt so glaring that long-term bilingual programs are really the best for our multilingual students and for all students. So what am I doing if I'm not working in one of these, if we can't all work in these programs? With that problematic setting in mind and this desire to somehow increase or inject bilingualism into my work, since it is so powerful, I encountered the idea of translanguaging. And I give you this picture at right, which I would call one portrait of translanguaging. Translanguaging, in short, it's using all of your linguistic resources. Anything and everything in your head. We think about multilinguals when we think about translanguaging, moving back and forth between linguistic resources in different languages, but monolinguals do it too. And I'm going to pause right here. I will use the term multilingual and monolingual today because they are categories that are helpful for how we think about groups of students or perhaps ourselves. But truly, there is no hard and fast distinction. We are all emerging bilinguals or multilinguals, to use a common term, Garcia's term. So while I use those terms, I want you to know that we're actually all in one pool of emerging multilingualism. That said, we all have our linguistic resources, and in some settings, we get to draw from all of them, making our ability to express ourselves, to formulate new thoughts, to think and therefore learn better. So, right here, I am in a vineyard in Argentina. I am a speaker of English, French, and really emerging Spanish at that point. Vicky and Alejandro are the older two people there. They are the owners of the farm. My friend Leah is a Swiss German, French, Spanish, and English speaker. And Jean Pierre in the back is a French, English, and Spanish speaker. And while Leah, Jean Pierre, and I are all there to learn Spanish, and so we often lean into practicing our Spanish skills, we are using all of our linguistic resources to make meaning and live in community together. We're using all of our linguistic resources towards the project of learning Spanish. But having these experiences, I got to feel what it's like to leverage linguistic resources across language. All right, so we don't want these white supremacist racial-linguistic climates. We want more bilingualism, and I have been teaching in wonderful urban schools in which students are so multilingual. I know we have these resources, so could translanguaging be the tool that could help my classroom setting be a space where students are able to leverage all of their languages, yes, towards learning English and towards full linguistic development, full human development, full personhood in the communities where they use language to be? This was my research question for my research. I'm not going to read it to you. If you want to pause it and read it, great. I'm going to briefly tell you about my research. Not that I think you really care, but I want you to show you that this is how I know a little bit about this topic, so I'm not just riffing. I was at Metropolitan State's Urban Teacher Program. It's awesome. I did an extensive literature review using these three terms. I ended up narrowing down to 20 contemporary articles about translanguaging in secondary ELA classrooms. Before we get into kind of what I found, let's back up and think about the big goal. If we saw white supremacist racial linguistic climates, how could we make better ones? What is the better option? We don't just want to tear something down. What do we want to build? What we want to create instead are liberatory racial-linguistic classrooms. These ideas come from a paper by Rosa and Flores. They talk about how colonization not only created racial categories, inventing a category of whiteness over a created category of blackness, brownness, indigeneity that was categorized as inferior. At the same time, language categories were created. And so languages associated with colonizers were lifted up as better, more civilized and pure, big air quotes around all that, while languages associated with those races that were being named and categorized as inferior also became inferior. The key thing to think about here is as we start to see white supremacy in action, we can also see linguistic supremacy in action. And this is where the racial-linguistic tie-in comes in. Not all multilingualism is treated the same in our society. If you take a minute, I bet you can come up with some examples. A simple one might be, how would a group of old white men speaking Norwegian exercising multilingualism in an English-dominant society be seen, versus a group of young Black men speaking Somali. We also get ideas of linguistic purity, how there is supposedly a right form of English, how some groups do not speak correct English, even though we know that languages are constantly evolving. All languages are full of multiple dialects that spur out of the communities that they are used in, that are valid so long as they are communicative and intelligible. That is it. However, you can think of examples surely in ELA classrooms in which we are taught, we have received these ideas, that some language is right and other language is wrong. Within this context, it's important to remember that our goal is not only bilingualism, which is better than only English dominance, but it's not enough, especially for our students of color in a world that will ratio-linguistically always see them differently than, for example, my Italian and Lithuanian ancestors who gave up Italian and Lithuanian language, absorbed whiteness and got to be, absorbed English and got to be absorbed into whiteness. So tolerance of other languages is not what we're going for. It's not good enough to just say, yay, we like Spanish. I appreciate that you speak Hmong. We actually want to overturn these hierarchies. We want education to be liberatory, such that we are revealing these hierarchies. We are critiquing them. We are challenging them with our students. With this big goal of creating more liberatory ratio-linguistic classrooms in mind, I think translanguaging can be a form of bite-sized bilingualism and a tool that can help us on this process. So, we talked about translanguaging. It's when you use all of your linguistic resources. It's when you are pulling from all of your languages, all of your dialects, all of your registers. It's good to remember that monolingual is translanguage too, but sometimes you're in situations, if you identify as monolingual, where you're not drawing from all of your registers, say every swear word you know with your boss, right? So thinking about ways in which our classrooms can become places where more translanguaging happens, where students are able to pull in more of their knowledges, their experiences, their emotions, their thinking through all of their linguistic resources. Let's imagine this classroom. Maybe a student is listening in English and they are writing in Spanish. Maybe a student is reading in Hmong and they are discussing with a partner in English. They're speaking to a certain group in English, to another group in Somali. I had a student that spoke Kinyarwanda last year. Perhaps they are searching and comparing online in multiple languages. One thing I want to make really clear in this web that we're sort of starting to imagine is that your multilingual students are already translanguaging to make sense of school. I want to highlight a few quotes from Daniel and Pacheco's 2016 research in which they looked into the existing translanguaging practices of 4 teenagers. One quote here: "Every day, Ma Nin uses 3 languages to make sense of schoolwork, responsibilities, and leisure activities." Another quote about another student: "Ong strategically translanguages when writing for school, even though her teacher did not suggest, acknowledge, or extend this practice." So it's happening, but in this way where students are trying to make sense of school, they are trying to communicate, they are trying to learn, they are always aware of the climate they're in. And often our schools are white supremacist, ratio-linguistic climates, such that a student like Ong might say something like this: "If you always use your language, it's like you're not really learning English. Just using LOTE stands for language other than English, sometimes when it's really needed. I mean, you should speak in English. If you speak in your language, it's like you don't really want to learn English." Sit with that. We want our students to feel supported encouraged, and we want to create spaces where students know that their other languages are welcome, that all of their languages are necessary, are valuable, and are tools towards their development as speakers of all many languages. What if instead translanguaging, this is coming from a paper on theorizing and enacting translanguaging for social justice, translanguaging could liberate the voices of language minoritized students? What if translanguaging could wipe out the hierarchy of languaging practices that deem some more valuable than others? And what if we teachers started by encouraging the translanguaging that's already happening? Maybe we allowed students to summarize what they just learned in a first language. Maybe we had multilingual word walls and bridging charts. Maybe then we started sewing in some first language opportunities for students to use. Maybe we gave more language control to students. Think about that as an equitable classroom practice. All right, if you are fast forwarding to get to the part where you want to learn the practices, here they are. We've got some food metaphors. Let's go. From these 20 articles I read, I found a number of strategies repeated, a number of themes, and one way to categorize these are as pizza strategies and paella. Pizza strategies are flexible, they are adaptive. Think about how pizza can be quick and cheap or elaborate and gourmet. Kind of goes the gamut. Paella, though, is more multi-stage, it's more responsive, it takes time, it takes multiple steps, but it has a bigger payoff. An example of a pizza strategy. This is called the translate procedure. And if you want one thing to take away here, you want to try one concrete thing, translate is really cool. You put students in small groups based on languages they speak. That could be a dialect like African American Vernacular English. That could be a community of students that speaks Hmong or Somali or Spanish. That could be students that are paraphrasing into another dialect or register of English, or even emojis. In these small groups, students will read. You are reading a text that you are reading in class. It could be an article, it could be a novel, and you are selecting for them, and perhaps later they could select, one short, rich sentence for them to translate. The sentence might have idioms. The sentence might have precise vocabulary. The sentence might have a specific grammatical structure or a character detail that's important. You're going to ask these groups of students as a team to translate that sentence into another language or another register or another dialect. The act of working together to look closely at language and actually translate it is a high cognitive process. This is a strategy I've done with students. I'll show you some examples, but students are really paying attention to the details of the sentence. They're asking each other questions. They might be arguing and conversing about different ways to translate, because translation is not something that is A to B, right? There's many right ways to do it. This then leads to students sharing what they have chosen for their translation, where they've gotten, and having rich meta-linguistics. This is a conversation about language, and thematic discussions after. The outcomes of this study, there's a series of studies, were increased reading comprehension because students are paying closer attention to this language, higher engagement, higher meta-linguistic awareness, and higher pride in multilingualism. Here are some examples from my former students. We were translating a stanza from Emily Dickinson's poem, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. This is a group that was translating into Somali. Notice I also had them reflect on what this process was like, and we talked about that. Different groups in Somali had different translations. And so we talked about, are there different words for these same ideas? Does that happen in English as well? How did you hear this? Who did you talk to? We also had groups translating into Hmong. We learned students organically went and talked to their families because they were at home and distance learning, and So that was wonderful. Students are drawing language resources from spaces that are not just the classroom, not just the teacher. That Hmong has a multi-word phrase that's sort of metaphorical for the word hope. We had Spanish translation. We had translation happening into African American vernacular English. We also had students that were paraphrasing. Some others translated into emojis. All right, that was the translate procedure, a real flexible one. If you want to go into something bigger, something more like a grandiose paella, one study I read talked about doing ethnographic classroom research with your students about your language practices in the classroom. So that might look like studying. What are the languages that we speak in our community? What are our experiences with different languages, registers, dialects? What are our attitudes or others' attitudes? Then analyzing that data together, and then designing a unit perhaps to further develop these language repertoires that you have discussed. Could be something that's specifically tied to the students' histories or a language zone like the internet. This study found that students were more engaged, that there were higher teacher expectations for students as teachers learned more about their students' languaging practices. That's powerful. There was more language use and more awareness of different languages in the classroom. All right, I got two more for you. Thanks for staying with me. Here is if you want a fruit, a short daily routine, a spontaneous opportunity, something small you could tuck in with translanguaging, or I've got a culminating project. All right, for your apple, your little fruit translanguagings, here's a big list. You could have students, just invite them, say it out loud. You can discuss this in a native language, in a language you speak that is not the one I'm lecturing in right now. You could have them summarize in another language. You could have a multilingual word wall or a multilingual vocabulary key. You could have texts available in multiple languages. You could do cognate instruction. You could have students engage in translation, a really high cognitive activity. You could also make talking about being bilingual, bilingual practice, bilingual experience, a totally normal thing in your classroom. Remember that the more we leverage home practices, things that students are already doing in their lives for academic success, the better students do, right? This is classic culturally responsive teaching. Finally, one more big example was a multimedia summative project, more of a dessert, if you will. This was a really cool project in which students were invited to create a My Hero presentation where they interviewed a personal hero after reading a text that was related to different values or characteristics of someone who we might consider culturally a hero. They were taught strategies to then create a multimedia PowerPoint to share what they learned. They were invited, not forced, never told you have to, use all their languages to interview, to conduct their research, to write text in their presentation, to do voiceovers, and to bring in musical elements. As a result of this project, the researchers found higher engagement, more normalization of multilingualism in the classroom, more use of all of students' languages in the classroom, and greater pride. I specifically remember reading here that some students who were quite hesitant to speak, to write, to be seen or known to speak the language that they speak at home, softened and changed and felt safer using that language over the course of the project. At this point, I'm asking you, what might you try? Could you do a flexible strategy like Translate, where you're asking students to translate one rich sentence in small language, dialect, register alike groups? Could you do classroom ethnographic research? Could this be an introduction to a project? Could this be a community building activity at the beginning of the year? Would you simply say the words, you can discuss this in any language? You can summarize this in any language. Could you advocate, get on Donors Choose for more texts in all students' languages? Or could you do some sort of summative project where students are invited to use all of their languages to interview someone in their community related to one of the essential questions in your unit? At this point, think about if you have any questions. Think about if you have one idea, one action that you could take away. I know I'm not right in front of you, so if you have questions, my email address is right there in the corner, anna.lehn@mpls.k12.mn.us. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear if you're using some of these strategies, if it's going well, if you're having struggles. I would love to talk about that. This is something I am just implementing in my classroom, and I really want to do it with you. So thank you for your time. And have a wonderful day, have a wonderful year exploring and experimenting with translanguaging towards more ratio-linguistically liberatory environments in our classroom. All the resources I listed are in the PowerPoint at the end.